Gunned down walking. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon and his wife Yoko Ono returned to their home at the Dakota apartment building on West 72nd Street in New York City. Lennon was 40 years old. He had spent the evening at the record plant recording studio working on music. It was a normal night for a man who had lived in New York for years and moved through the city with a degree of ease that came from familiarity. The Dakota was one of the most recognizable residential buildings in Manhattan, a massive 19th century structure on the corner of Central Park West. Lennon had chosen it as his home precisely because he valued the life he had built there, close to the park, close to the city, settled. Earlier that same day, outside the Dakota, a man named Mark David Chapman had approached Lennon and asked him to sign a copy of his album. Lennon signed it. Chapman was there when Lennon left for the studio that afternoon, and he was still there when Lennon returned that night. The limousine carrying Lennon and Ono pulled up to the building's entrance at approximately 10:50 p.m. They stepped out and walked toward the archway that led into the building's interior courtyard. Chapman was standing in the shadows of that archway. As Lennon walked past him, Chapman called out. He then dropped into a combat stance, raised a revolver, and fired 5 shots. 4 of them struck Lennon in the upper back and left shoulder area. Lennon staggered forward through the entrance. He made it to the security booth inside the building before collapsing. He told the doorman he had been shot. 2 New York City police officers arrived within minutes. The wounds were immediately visible and severe. The officers made the decision not to wait for an ambulance. They loaded Lennon into the back of a patrol car and drove at speed toward Roosevelt Hospital. It took them approximately 2 minutes to reach the emergency entrance. Medical teams were waiting. Doctors worked to address the blood loss, but the damage caused by the 4 gunshot wounds was beyond what could be repaired. Lennon had lost an enormous amount of blood. The injuries to the major vessels in the region of the wounds were severe. Nothing the medical team attempted was able to reverse what had already happened inside his body. John Lennon was pronounced dead on arrival at Roosevelt Hospital. The time was recorded as 11:15 p.m. The cause of death was hypovolemic shock resulting from multiple gunshot wounds. He was 40 years old. Mark David Chapman did not attempt to flee. He remained at the scene, reading a paperback book, until police arrested him. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. He has appeared before the parole board multiple times and has been denied release on each occasion. Yacht lost at sea. On the morning of November 5th, 1991, crew members aboard the Lady Ghislaine discovered that Robert Maxwell was not on the yacht. Maxwell was 68 years old. He was a British media mogul who had built a publishing and communications empire that spanned multiple continents. His wealth was measured in the billions. The Lady Ghislaine, his private yacht, was a vessel he used regularly, often conducting business from it while traveling between ports. It was a fixture of his public image as much as it was a mode of transport. Maxwell had boarded the Lady Ghislaine days earlier. The yacht was sailing in waters near the Canary Islands off the northwest coast of Africa. On the night of November 4th into the early hours of November 5th, Maxwell had reportedly retired to his cabin. Nothing unusual was noted by the crew during that time. The sea conditions in the area were not recorded as severe. The yacht continued on its course through the night. When crew members went to check on him the following morning, his cabin was empty. A search of the vessel found nothing. Maxwell was not on board. A search operation was launched. Spanish maritime and aviation authorities coordinated with the crew to sweep the surrounding waters. Approximately 20 miles from the yacht's position, Maxwell's body was found floating in the Atlantic Ocean. A Spanish military helicopter was used to recover him from the water. His body was transported to Las Palmas and Gran Canaria, where an initial autopsy was conducted by Spanish pathologists. That examination concluded that the cause of death was a heart attack, with drowning listed as a contributing factor. The findings suggested that Maxwell had suffered a cardiac event, and that he had entered the water either as a result of that event or in connection with it. The findings were disputed. Maxwell's family commissioned a second autopsy, which was conducted in Israel before his burial. The Israeli examination found evidence of heart muscle damage consistent with a cardiac event occurring at or near the time of death, but the 2 sets of pathologists did not arrive at identical conclusions. The question of whether Maxwell had fallen accidentally from the yacht, whether he had chosen to leave, or whether something else had occurred, was never definitively answered by any official investigation. Robert Maxwell was confirmed dead on November 5th, 1991. He was 68 years old. The officially recorded cause of death was heart attack with drowning as a contributing factor. How he entered the water was never officially determined. flight into mountain. On October 20th, 2014, Christophe de Margerie departed a late evening meeting in Moscow and made his way to Vnukovo Airport on the city's southwestern edge. De Margerie was 63 years old. He was the chief executive officer of Total SA, one of the largest oil and gas companies in the world. He was well known within the energy industry, recognizable in part for his distinctive appearance, and he traveled regularly between Paris and Moscow, given Total's substantial business interests in Russia. That night, he was scheduled to depart in the company's private aircraft, a Dassault Falcon 50, and return to France. Vnukovo Airport was operational that evening. It was after midnight local time when de Margerie arrived at the airfield. Fog had settled across the airport. Visibility was reduced. Ground operations were underway, including snow clearance work on the airfield surfaces. Vehicles and equipment were moving across different areas of the airport as the aircraft prepared for departure. De Margerie and 3 crew members boarded the Falcon 50. The aircraft began its takeoff roll down the runway. Simultaneously, a snowplow was operating on the airfield. The driver of the snowplow moved the vehicle across the active runway without authorization. The Falcon 50, accelerating through its takeoff run, struck the snowplow with its right wing and landing gear. The collision occurred at takeoff speed. The impact was immediate and complete. The aircraft did not recover. It broke apart and came down on the runway surface, and fire erupted from the wreckage within moments of the impact. The plane never became airborne after the collision. It did not travel beyond the runway environment. Emergency crews at Vnukovo Airport responded to the burning wreckage. All 4 people aboard the aircraft were located within the debris. De Margerie and all 3 crew members were confirmed dead at the scene. No one aboard survived the crash. Russian aviation investigators launched a formal inquiry into the accident. The investigation identified the snowplow driver as having been on the active runway without authorization at the time of the collision. Russian prosecutors pursued charges. The snowplow driver was found to have a blood alcohol level above the legal limit at the time of the accident. He was charged along with several airport officials who held responsibility for runway coordination and ground traffic management. Christophe de Margerie was pronounced dead at the scene on October 20th, 2014. He was 63 years old. The cause of death was traumatic injuries sustained in the crash. Found in Geneva. On February 28, 2005, Edouard Stern was found dead inside his Geneva apartment. Stern was 50 years old. He was a French national and one of the most prominent figures in European private equity, known for high-stakes financial dealings and a profile that placed him consistently among the wealthiest individuals in France and across the continent. His personal life was kept largely from public view. He maintained the Geneva apartment as part of a life divided across multiple cities. Stern had a relationship with a Frenchwoman named Cécile Brosser. On the night of his death, the two had been together inside the apartment. Stern was found inside the property. He had been shot 4 times. He was wearing a latex bodysuit. Swiss police were called and a homicide investigation was opened immediately. The circumstances of what had occurred inside the apartment were not disclosed in full detail by Swiss investigators during the subsequent proceedings. Brossard was identified as a suspect. She was located and arrested by Swiss authorities. The case moved through the Swiss legal system over the following years. It attracted wide coverage in France and Switzerland, driven by the prominence of the victim and the nature of what investigators had found at the scene. In 2009, a Swiss court convicted Cécile Brosser of murder. She was sentenced to 8.5 years in prison. Edouard Stern was 50 years old at the time of his death on February 28, 2005. The cause of death was gunshot wounds. Cécile Brosser served her sentence following conviction. Ambushed in Beirut. On February 14, 2005, Rafik Hariri traveled through Beirut by motorcade. Hariri was 60 years old. He was a former prime minister of Lebanon who had stepped down from that office months earlier, but who remained one of the most powerful and recognizable figures in Lebanese politics and the Arab business world. He had built his fortune through a construction and real estate empire that operated across the Middle East, and his wealth placed him firmly among the region's billionaire class. He was known in Lebanon not only for his political career, but for large-scale reconstruction efforts he had championed following years of civil war. His movements on that morning followed the patterns of a man who remained active in public life, despite no longer holding office. He traveled with a security detail, as was standard for someone of his prominence and political profile. The motorcade made its way along the seafront in central Beirut, passing through an area near the Saint-Georges Hotel, a landmark on the city's waterfront. A vehicle had been positioned along the route. It was a Mitsubishi Canter van. It had been loaded with explosives equivalent to approximately 1,000 kilograms of TNT. As Hariri's motorcade passed, the device was detonated. The explosion was of a scale that left a crater approximately 10 meters meters wide and 2 meters deep in the road surface. Vehicles within the convoy were destroyed. Buildings in the surrounding blocks sustained severe structural damage. Windows were shattered across a wide area of the Beirut waterfront. The force of the blast was felt and heard across significant portions of the city. Emergency services arrived at a scene of mass destruction. 22 people were confirmed dead, including Hariri. Dozens more were wounded. The scale of the damage and the nature of the device left no ambiguity about the intent. This was not an opportunistic attack. The bomb had been placed specifically along a route that Hariri was known to travel. The international response was immediate. The United Nations Security Council called for an independent investigation into the assassination. A process was set in motion that ultimately led to the creation of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, a UN-backed court established specifically to bring prosecutions in connection with the attack. Rafik Hariri died on February 14th, 2005. He was 60 years old. The cause of death was injuries sustained in the explosion. In 2020, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon convicted Salim Ayyash in connection with the attack. The conviction was handed down in absentia. Ayyash has not been taken into custody. Shot leaving work. On the evening of July 9, 2004, Paul Klebnikov stepped out of the offices of Forbes Russia in central Moscow. Klebnikov was 41 years old. He was an American journalist who had built Forbes Russia into one of the most scrutinized publications operating inside the country. The magazine regularly published rankings of Russia's wealthiest individuals and investigative reporting on the oligarch class that had emerged in the years following the Soviet collapse. In a media environment where such coverage carried significant risk, Klebnikov had continued publishing. He had received threats. He was aware of the environment in which he operated. The Forbes Russia offices were located in central Moscow. Klebnikov had worked through the day on July 9th. That evening, he left the building. As he stepped outside, a gunman fired multiple shots at him at close range. Klebnikov was struck and fell in the street directly outside the building's entrance. People were present in the surrounding area when the shooting occurred. Emergency services were called. Klebnikov was transported to a Moscow hospital. He underwent surgery in an attempt to address the damage caused by the gunshot wounds. He died on the operating table. The cause of death was the gunshot wounds he had sustained outside the building. Russian investigators launched a murder inquiry. 2 Chechen men were arrested and brought to trial. In 2006, a jury acquitted both defendants. The acquittal was contested and the case was referred back through the Russian legal system. As of the available public record, no individual has served a prison sentence in connection with the murder of Paul Klebnikov. The case has not been publicly resolved with a confirmed conviction. Klebnikov was 41 years old. He died on July 9, 2004. Fire in Monaco. On the night of December 2nd into the early hours of December 3rd, 1999, a fire was set inside the penthouse apartment of Edmond Safra in Monaco. Safra was 67 years old. He was the founder of Republic National Bank of New York, one of the most significant private banking institutions of the 20th century, and his personal wealth placed him among the wealthiest individuals in the world. He was known for extreme caution in his personal security arrangements. His Monaco penthouse reflected that caution. It was heavily secured, staffed around the clock, and access was tightly controlled. Safra lived with health conditions including Parkinson's disease that required ongoing nursing care. On the night in question, multiple nurses were on duty at the apartment. One of them was an American man named Ted Maher, a former Green Beret who had been employed as part of Safra's personal care staff. In the early hours of December 3rd, Maher set fires inside the apartment. He later told investigators that his intention had been to set a small fire, raise the alarm, and then appear to rescue Safra, manufacturing a moment of heroism. What he created instead was a fire that grew beyond what he had planned. Safra and a nurse named Vivian Torrente were woken by the alarm. Rather than evacuating the apartment, the two retreated to a marble bathroom and barricaded themselves inside. It was later established that they feared an intruder was in the apartment and chose to shelter in place rather than move through the building. Firefighters arrived and worked to bring the blaze under control. The marble construction of the bathroom provided some resistance to the fire itself, but it did not protect against what the fire produced. Smoke filled the space where Safra and Torrente had taken refuge. When firefighters reached the bathroom, both were found dead inside. The cause of death for both was established as asphyxiation from smoke inhalation. Maher had also inflicted stab wounds on himself before emergency services arrived, in an apparent attempt to present the appearance of having fought an intruder. He was found at the scene, and his involvement was established in the subsequent investigation. Edmond Safra was pronounced dead on December 3rd, 1999. He was 67 years old. The cause of death was asphyxiation due to smoke inhalation. Ted Maher was convicted by a Monaco court of arson causing death and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Small Plain, Venezuela. On January 4, 2013, Vittorio Missoni and his wife Maurizia Castiglione boarded a small charter aircraft at Los Roques, a Venezuelan island archipelago in the Caribbean Sea. Missoni was 58 years old. He was the head of the Missoni Fashion House, one of Italy's most recognized luxury brands, a company his family had built across generations into a global name. He and his wife had been vacationing at Los Roques, an island destination popular with European travelers, seeking remote beaches and calm water. On the morning of January 4th, the holiday was over. They were departing for Caracas. The aircraft was a Britten-Norman BN-2 Islander, a small twin-engine plane used routinely for inter-island transport in the Caribbean region. There were 6 people aboard in total, including Missoni and Castiglione. The flight from Los Roques to Caracas was a short one, a routine island-to-mainland hop that the aircraft type was designed to make. The plane departed Los Roques and climbed away from the island. Shortly after takeoff, it disappeared from radar. No distress signal was transmitted. No radio communication indicating a problem was received by air traffic controllers. The aircraft simply ceased to appear on tracking systems and did not make contact again. When the flight failed to arrive in Caracas, authorities were alerted. A search and rescue operation was organized involving Venezuelan Coast Guard assets and aviation search teams. Italian authorities were also notified, given the nationality and prominence of those aboard. The search covered open water between Los Roques and the Venezuelan mainland. Wreckage was located in the sea. Human remains were recovered from the water, along with personal belongings that were subsequently identified as belonging to those who had been aboard the aircraft. The identifications confirmed that all 6 people on the flight had been on the plane when it went down. What caused the aircraft to crash was not publicly established. No official confirmed cause was released in the available record. The exact circumstances of the final moments of the flight were not determined. All 6 people aboard were confirmed dead. Vittorio Missoni was 58 years old. Maurizia Castiglione perished alongside him. The date of the crash was January 4th, 2013. The cause of the crash was not officially determined. Killed at home. On December 15th, 2017, a real estate agent arrived at a house in the North York neighborhood of Toronto to show the property to prospective buyers. The home belonged to Barry and Honey Sherman. Barry Sherman was 75 years old. He was the founder of Apotex Inc., one of the largest generic pharmaceutical companies in the world, a business he had built from a small operation into a global manufacturer whose drugs were used by millions of patients. His wealth was estimated in the billions. Honey Sherman was 70 years old. The couple were prominent figures in Toronto's philanthropic community, known for significant charitable contributions across multiple causes. The house had been listed for sale, and the showing that day was routine. The agent made a discovery inside the lower level of the home, near the indoor swimming pool. Barry and Honey Sherman were found dead. Both were in a semi-seated position beside the pool, with leather belts looped around their necks and attached to the pool railing. There were no signs of forced entry into the property. Nothing about the scene indicated that the deaths had been self-inflicted. Toronto Police Service launched an investigation. In the initial days of the inquiry, police made a public statement characterizing the deaths as a possible murder-suicide. That characterization was retracted within days. The Sherman family had immediately disputed the initial framing and retained private investigators. Both the family's investigators and additional consultants working with police concluded that the evidence did not support the murder-suicide theory. The case was formally reclassified as a double homicide. The investigation that followed was one of the most extensive in Toronto's recent history. Forensic work was conducted at the property. Investigators conducted interviews across a wide circle of the Shermans' professional and personal connections. The case attracted significant coverage in Canada and internationally, given the stature of the victims and the unresolved nature of what had occurred inside a secured home in one of the city's wealthiest neighborhoods. A coroner's inquest was also conducted. The cause of death for both Barry and Honey Sherman was determined to be ligature neck compression. The manner of death for both was ruled homicide. No charges have been filed in connection with the deaths of Barry and Honey Sherman. No arrest has been made. The case remains open. Barry Sherman was 75 years old. Honey Sherman was 70 years old. Both died on or before December 15th, 2017. The case is unsolved. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.